Night swallowed the horizon, but the harbor was bright as a stadium. A string of white flares hung over Taranto and drifted downward, hissing as they burned. Their light turned the water into polished steel and painted every battleship at anchor into a target with a name. Down at mast height, almost skimming the rooftops and balloon cables, an old biplane came in so low that spray from the harbor mouth seemed close enough to taste. Its engine did not howl like a modern fighter's. It chugged steady, stubborn, almost agricultural. Anti-aircraft guns opened all at once. Tracers climbed in red ladders. Searchlights swung, found nothing, then found everything. In the front cockpit, the pilot held the nose level and refused every instinct that begged him to jink or climb. A torpedo hung beneath the belly on a centerline cradle, heavy as a promise. At a few dozen feet above the water, he released it. For a heartbeat, it dropped like a stone, then struck the surface with a flat slap instead of a deep dive. It ran straight, a pale wake cutting across the flare-lit harbor. Somewhere ahead, steel met explosive force. A muffled submarine thump rolled across Taranto. A battleship's hull shuddered. Men on decks and in gun tubs felt the impact through their boots before they understood what had happened. And the biplane, that so many had dismissed as a museum piece, kept flying directly into the storm it had created. This happened on the night of 11-12 November 1940, over the Italian naval base of Taranto. The aircraft was the Fairey Swordfish, an open cockpit, fabric-covered biplane that looked like it belonged to the last war. Not this one. The attackers were the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm, launched from the carrier HMS Illustrious. The defenders were the Regia Marina's battle fleet, anchored beneath the assumption that shallow water and harbor defenses made them safe. What followed in little more than an hour changed the Mediterranean balance and rewired the world's idea of what a fleet could survive. This story was not about speed. It was about nerve, preparation, and a weapon everyone thought could not work in a harbor like this until it did. To understand why Taranto became a warning shot heard across oceans, it helped to start with the airplane itself, because the Swordfish was the kind of aircraft that invited sarcasm before it invited fear. By 1940, aviation was racing forward. Sleek monoplanes with enclosed cockpits, retractable landing gear, and cannon armament were shaping a new style of combat. Against that backdrop, the Swordfish looked stubbornly out of date. Two wings stacked one above the other, a lattice of struts and wires, fixed landing gear, and cockpits open to salt wind and cold. It had entered service in the mid-1930s and already seemed old-fashioned then. Even its friends joked about the string bag, the affectionate nickname that hinted at a machine that could carry almost anything, even if it carried it slowly. Slow was the problem everyone could see. A torpedo bomber that could be caught was a torpedo bomber that would die. A biplane attacking a modern harbor at night sounded like a story with a short ending. If the Swordfish had any defenders, they were the men who flew and maintained it. They knew it was steady, reliable, and forgiving. They knew it could lift a torpedo off a carrier deck and still behave like a predictable partner in the dark. And they understood something that looked like a weakness could become a kind of camouflage. What was too slow to be modern was sometimes too strange to be anticipated. In the Mediterranean, the stakes were immediate. Italy entered the war in June 1940. The sea lanes through the Mediterranean mattered to Britain's ability to supply Malta and sustain operations in North Africa. The Italian Navy possessed powerful battleships and cruiser ships that, on paper, could make British convoys a gamble and British strategy a crisis. The Regia Marina was also cautious, often reluctant to risk its big ships in a decisive battle. That caution was not cowardice so much as arithmetic. Italy's industry could not casually replace battleships, so the fleet became a threat even while it remained mostly at anchor, a heavy shadow across the map. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the British Mediterranean Fleet, understood he did not need to sink every Italian warship. He needed to change the balance enough that his convoys could breathe. If the Italians would not come out and fight, Cunningham would reach into their harbor and damage the ships where they slept. The idea was older than the war. British planners had considered striking Taranto years earlier. What changed in 1940 was opportunity. The arrival of HMS Illustrious and a carrier air commander with the will to turn a plan into a night raid. Rear Admiral Lumley Lister brought a proposal that sounded audacious and, in some rooms, irresponsible. Use carrier aircraft to torpedo battleships at anchor in their own base. Torpedoes were the key, and they were also the doubt. Conventional wisdom argued that an air-dropped torpedo required deep water to recover from its entry and settle into a stable running depth. Taranto's outer harbor was shallow, about 40 feet. The Italians believed this fact was a shield. They prepared for bombs and shell fire. They did not fully fear torpedoes, but the British had been experimenting. They found ways to make an aerial torpedo behave like a disciplined weapon instead of a plunging projectile. They kept the drop low. They adjusted the torpedo's entry so it would not spear downward into the mud. They practiced until impossible became merely difficult. Even then, Taranto almost did not happen. The strike was first planned for late October. Then a hangar accident set fire aboard Illustrious, destroying and damaging aircraft and forcing a postponement until a better moon. The attack depended on visibility. Crews had to find the harbor in darkness, identify targets, and return to their carrier at night. A bright moon was not romantic. It was navigation, recognition, and survival. There was another complication. The original plan called for 2 carriers, Illustrious and the older HMS Eagle, to put a larger number of Swordfish over Taranto. Eagle developed serious problems. Its aviation fuel systems raised the specter of catastrophe. The carrier was withdrawn. Illustrious would strike alone, with fewer aircraft than planned. By early November, accidents and mechanical troubles bit again. Aircraft were lost in mishaps. Fuel contamination created anxieties that had to be solved with labor on the deck and in the hangar. When the final count was made, the strike force was reduced, but not broken. The number that remained was small enough to feel reckless and large enough to matter. 21 Swordfish available for the mission, divided into 2 waves because Illustrious could launch only a dozen at a time. On the Italian side, Taranto's defenses were real but imperfect. Barrage balloons, tethered by cables designed to shred wings, formed a deadly fence. Torpedo nets were meant to intercept or deflect incoming weapons. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the base. And yet fortune, weather, and routine created cracks. A storm tore away many barrage balloons days before the raid, and they had not been fully replaced. Torpedo nets were not always in place exactly as they should have been. In war, defenses were not just hardware, they were habits, and habits could be interrupted. The crews who would fly into that bright harbor had to compress all of this into something usable. Routes, timings, fuel calculations, signals, and the terrifying discipline required to fly straight and low while being shot at from every direction. The Swordfish crews were not naive about the aircraft's limitations. They compensated with method. The observer's role navigation, identification, timing was normally vital, but the Taranto torpedo runs required extra fuel for range. With a torpedo mounted beneath the fuselage An auxiliary fuel tank could not hang underneath as usual, so fuel was moved into the crew space and crews were rearranged. In some torpedo aircraft, the gunner was removed to make weight and room work within the narrow margins of the plan. Every decision was an argument with physics. On Illustrious that evening, the first wave prepared on deck. The carrier was not far from Taranto, but the distance still demanded careful navigation in darkness over water. Shortly before the launches, reconnaissance confirmed the Italian fleet was still in place. 6 battleships lay in the harbor complex, along with cruisers and destroyers and the infrastructure that made Taranto a naval heart. At around 8:30 p.m., the first wave lifted off 12 Swordfish, disappearing into the Mediterranean night. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson led them. Each aircraft carried a role. Some bore torpedoes for the battleships, some carried bombs to strike other ships and shore targets, and a couple carried flares to turn the harbor into a lit stage for the attackers. Then the first small twist arrived, the kind that seemed minor until it suddenly mattered. On the way to Taranto, the formation met fog. Most climbed to get above it, following procedures meant to keep the strike together and on time. One pilot did not. Lieutenant Ian Swain continued at a lower altitude. Separated from the main body, he believed he was behind schedule and pushed on toward the target. In reality, he was ahead. It meant that the first Swordfish to reach Taranto arrived early and alone, a slow biplane announcing itself to the base's listening devices and then to the guns. The defenders had no night fighter capability ready to intercept. No attackers would be chased by a modern fighter in the black sky that night. But the harbor's gunners were awake now. They were firing before the main wave arrived. The raid's element of surprise fractured slightly, and every crew coming behind would pay for it. That was Taranto's first warning. It was also the first proof that the defenders' most modern tools did not matter if they could not be used in the dark. When the main portion of the first wave approached, the flare carriers went in first and did their job with devastating simplicity. Flares fell and ignited, casting light across the outer harbor. Battleships that had been silhouettes became sharp targets. Defensive fire rose toward the flare droppers, but the geometry was unforgiving. By the time gunners aimed and fired, the aircraft had already moved. Now came the biplanes with torpedoes, and this was where the entire operation either became history or became tragedy. They had to fly low enough for the torpedoes to enter the water correctly, low enough to thread balloon gaps and avoid cable traps, low enough to avoid giving gunners comfortable angles. But low meant vulnerability. A slow aircraft at low altitude over a bright harbor was the easiest sort of target in theory. In practice, theory had to confront a more complicated battlefield. The Italians faced a problem of their own. Firing at extremely low-flying aircraft risked hitting their own ships. Searchlights could blind gunners as easily as they illuminated targets. The harbor's defense network was powerful, but it was designed for expected threats. The Swordfish was not an expected threat. Williamson's aircraft swept in and released its torpedo on a battleship in the outer harbor. The weapon ran true and struck. And then the attackers met the price of proximity. Williamson's Swordfish was hit and went down into the harbor. He and his observer, Norman Scarlett, survived the crash and were fished from the water by the Italians. They would spend the rest of the war as prisoners. They had delivered their torpedo and then vanished, swallowed by the very harbor they had opened. It was a victory and a warning in the same moment. The raid could succeed, but it did not forgive. Around them, other swordfish pressed in and dropped. In the flare light, torpedo tracks became white scars on the water. Explosions rolled across the anchorage. Crews could not always tell which hit belonged to which aircraft because the rhythm of attack was fast and violent, but the effect was unmistakable. The Italian battle line was being wounded at anchor. The first wave withdrew into darkness, leaving fire and confusion behind. Then there was a lull long enough for defenders to imagine they had endured the worst, and short enough for that hope to be a mistake. Back aboard Illustrious, the second wave had already been prepared. It launched later in the evening, led by Lieutenant Commander J.W. Hale. The second wave carried its own mix of torpedoes, bombs, and flares. It also carried the attrition that came with operating from a cramped deck at night. 2 aircraft bumped wings during the launch sequence. One was still able to fly. Another had to be repaired before it could even take off, and it launched late, chasing the raid it was meant to join. Another Swordfish suffered a more crippling loss. Its auxiliary fuel tank detached and fell into the sea, forcing the aircraft to abort and return. The second wave was reduced by mishap before it ever met enemy fire. What reached Taranto in the second wave still arrived with enough force to keep the story moving. The flare droppers went in again, turning the harbor bright once more. The defenders fired upward and outward into a sky that would not give them a clean solution. The attackers threaded the spaces between balloon cables and came in at the kind of altitude that made courage look like routine. A second Swordfish was hit by anti-aircraft fire and fell burning into the water. This time, there would be no rescue. The pilot, Lieutenant G.W. Bailey, and the observer, Lieutenant H.J. Slaughter, were killed. Taranto took its payment in lives as well as metal. But the raid continued. More torpedoes ran. More detonations struck the hulls of battleships that represented not just naval power, but national prestige. Damage control teams rushed below decks, fighting flooding and chaos in compartments that had never imagined this kind of underwater injury while at anchor. The most heavily hit battleship of the night took multiple torpedoes and was left with its bow deeply flooded. Another was struck and forced toward shallow water to avoid sinking outright. A third, hit hard, would settle with its superstructure above the surface, effectively removed from the war. Around them, other ships were struck or damaged, and shore installations burned. In roughly an hour, a small group of biplanes had done what fleets of heavy guns struggled to accomplish quickly. They had disabled capital ships. There was one more small episode that revealed how thin the margins had been. The delayed Swordfish from the second wave finally arrived after midnight, alone and late, and attacked a cruiser in the inner harbor. Its bomb hit the target but failed to detonate. In another universe, that bomb explodes, and the list of damage grows longer. In this one, it became a reminder that even the most carefully planned raid still depended on the behavior of a fuse. By the time the last Swordfish turned away, Taranto was a different place than it had been at dinner. The attackers navigated back toward Illustrious over dark water, the most dangerous part of any night strike. One by one, biplanes found the carrier and returned, landing in the small hours. The last aircraft came aboard near 3 in the morning. The raid was finished, and the scale of what had been done began to settle in. Dawn and reconnaissance made the damage undeniable. Ships that had been symbols now sat low in the water, with decks awash. The Italian Navy could not hide the truth from its own officers, its own sailors, or the sea itself. 3 battleships had been put out of action, one never to return to service, and others were damaged. A handful of aircraft had achieved this at the cost of only 2 Swordfish destroyed and a small number of men killed or captured. The efficiency was shocking. On the British side, Cunningham's satisfaction carried an edge of disbelief. The feeling of a plan that had been bold enough to fail and had instead succeeded. The Italian fleet's response was practical and revealing. Major units were moved away from Taranto afterward, seeking safer harbors and reducing the direct threat to British convoy routes. The Mediterranean did not become calm, and the war did not become easy. But the geometry shifted. A fleet that had been an anchor of Italian strategy now had to behave like a fleet under siege, even in its own ports. The Swordfish's transformation from something mocked as obsolete into an instrument of strategic shock was not magic. It was a combination of factors that rarely aligned so perfectly. The absence of effective night fighter interception, weaknesses in balloon and net defenses, the discipline of low-level approach, and a technical solution that made shallow water torpedo attack possible. Each link mattered. Remove one, and Taranto might have become a tragedy with no legend. And yet, the legend spread, because the message was too useful to ignore. Navies around the world watched and learned. The idea that battleships could shelter behind harbor defenses and shallow water became harder to defend. Taranto did not invent the aircraft carrier's importance, but it forced the debate into a new shape. Now it was not just that aircraft could threaten ships at sea. It was that aircraft could enter a guarded harbor at night and disable capital ships that had not even raised steam. Some observers treated Taranto as a singular British triumph tied to a particular moment. Others treated it as a rehearsal for the future. Across the world, planners were already thinking about what an aerial torpedo could do if it could be adapted to shallow water. Taranto demonstrated feasibility. It did not write every subsequent plan by itself, but it made certain possibilities feel less like fantasy. A harbor was not the safety it claimed to be. Not anymore. The irony was sharp. The weapon that made the point was delivered by an aircraft that looked backward. The Swordfish's slowness, so often mocked, became part of its night utility. It could be flown with precision at low altitude. It could hold a steady line during the most dangerous seconds of a torpedo drop. Its simple construction and forgiving handling helped crews do hard things in darkness, where complexity could become fragility. It did not need to be fast to ruin a battleship's night. It needed to be there. Taranto also revealed something about the psychology of defense. The Italians had many guns, but they did not have the right kind of night interception. They had balloons, but weather had already thinned the screen. They had nets, but human routine and competing demands interfered. Defense was not one thing. It was a chain of many small decisions, and that chain could be weakened by something as mundane as a storm several days earlier. For the men who lived through the raid on both sides, the experience was more intimate than strategy. British aircrew punched through a glowing harbor at speeds that made them feel exposed to every rifle and cannon. Italian sailors heard torpedoes detonate below them inside a base they believed was protected by the very depth of the water. Damage control teams fought flooding in compartments, filling with seawater they had never expected to face at anchor. Gunners fired until barrels heated, aiming at planes that did not maneuver the way modern aircraft were expected to maneuver. Many defenders remembered the sound, not the scream of a dive bomber, but the persistent engine note of a biplane that refused to go away. The raid's larger lesson was confirmed again and again as the war progressed. It was not always the most modern platform that delivered the decisive blow. Sometimes it was the platform that fit the mission and the moment. Taranto needed steadiness, navigation, and a torpedo solution in shallow water. It needed crews willing to fly straight into concentrated fire at night, for a plan that demanded calm at the worst possible time. The Swordfish would prove this was not a one-night trick. Months later, during the pursuit of the German battleship Bismarck, Swordfish torpedo bombers would again enter bad weather and dangerous conditions to deliver the kind of hit that changed an operation's outcome. Again, the aircraft would look absurd beside the ships it attacked. Again, its limitations would fail to prevent it from being decisive. The string bag, mocked by silhouette, would keep returning at the moments naval history could least ignore. In the end, Taranto's numbers were not merely statistics. They were a narrative weapon. A small strike force, 2 waves, a brief window of time, and 3 battleships disabled. For a navy designed around big gun ships as the ultimate argument, it was an emotional shock as much as a tactical one. It suggested that the fortress walls around battleship doctrine were thinner than anyone wanted to admit. After Taranto, the Mediterranean War continued with new complications. German air power would increasingly shape the theater, and the sea would remain contested. But that single night had removed comfortable illusions. It proved that under the right conditions, a carrier could reach into a strongly defended harbor and cripple a fleet. It proved that shallow water was not a guarantee of safety. It proved that the future did not always arrive with sleek lines and high speed. Sometimes it arrived with struts and wires, flying low under flares, doing the one thing everyone said could not be done. The biplane that invited laughter had forced admirals to start thinking in a new language. Not, how thick is the armor, but how good is the air defense at night? Not, how deep is the water, but can a torpedo be made to run shallow? Not, where can we anchor safely? But, is there any safe anchorage at all? In Taranto's flare light, the Swordfish looked like an anachronism. In Taranto's aftermath, it looked like a messenger. The era when fleets could sleep behind water and steel ended in the space of a single raid. Those who still believed otherwise simply had not yet received the same message. They would.